Hello, my name is Andre Ward, and I'm the Associate Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives, including people most impacted by the criminal legal system. We discuss critical questions about how the system works, its intersections with social justice, and we highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone affected. We ask you, the viewers, to spread the word about Both Sides of the Bars and share your comments with us on Twitter at Fortune Society SOC. Today's show is entitled 2019 Year in Review, Criminal Justice Reform and Beyond. 2019 has been a year of huge changes within the criminal justice reform movement. In this episode, executive leaders who have been directly impacted will discuss those changes and what lies ahead in 2020 and beyond. I'm honored to have four extremely knowledgeable experts with me on these subjects today. They'll discuss what's going on in 2019. We have Julio Medina. He's the founder and CEO of Exodus Transitional Community. We have DeAnna R. Hoskins, who is the president and CEO of JustLeadershipUSA. We have the Reverend Vivian D. Nixon, who's the executive director of College and Community Fellowship, and Stanley Richards, who is the executive vice president of the Fortune Society. Ladies, gentlemen, leaders, colleagues, welcome to Both Sides of the Bars.
Thank you.
So good to have you guys join. And I know that it took some time to get all of you in the same room together, but thank you so much for indulging us and partaking in this discussion. Want to kind of jump right into it a little bit, right, for the sake of our listening audience. And, talk to us a little bit about like the work you do, how long that your organization's been around, and then we'll jump right into what's happened in 2019. We'll start with Vivian.
Sure, I'll be extremely brief. It's becoming harder and harder for me to do a 3-minute speech because our organization has been growing since 2000, so that's 20 years of growth. Mm-hmm. Primarily, we work with women who are involved in the criminal justice system, beginning 180 days pre-release, all the way through college graduation. Mm-hmm. As a program focused on college, we are very committed to people graduating from college and not just enrolling in college. We connect that to a various amount of services that we provide, but the primary service we provide is the building of a community of like-minded women that support each other through this college process and then through finding careers that are meaningful to them. We want to raise the bar, that just having a job and a place to live does not check off the box that you're successfully reintegrated into society. We want people to do what they love and what they dream of, and to reinvent themselves in a way that proves that they can have long-term stability and not just a temporary fix.
Sure, and I like the idea of community and the idea of building women and empowering them in a way by way of education and other things. So thank you so much for the work you're doing with that, Vivian. And Stan, like you work at the Fortune Society. Talk to us a little about the work you do at Fortune.
So Fortune is a 52-year-old organization. We see about 7,000 men and women a year. Mm-hmm. And we have a threefold mission. One is to prevent so many people from going into the system. And that's about providing an off-ramp, providing an alternative for people to not go to jail and prison. Mm-hmm. The second thing is we are a safety net when people come home. We provide the wraparound services so that people can build new lives and reintegrate with their family and back with their community. And then the third thing we do is we advocate and we change policy that has chewed up so many black and brown men and women in our communities that we know don't work over time. And what we say is we need to change those policies. And then when we change the policies and reduce the expenses that we pay to incarcerate and do so much damage, to reinvest those resources back into the communities most impacted.
So wraparound services, reinvesting in people, in communities, building up human beings, yes, all of which is important to the reentry process. Absolutely. Right? Consistent with what Vivian's doing with her work. And DeAnna. DeAnna, thanks for joining us. You're heading up Just Leadership's work. Talk to us about that.
So, and actually we're the baby at the on this panel. Just Leadership has been around since 2015, created on the premises that those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So our goal is the individuals that are served through the various programs of other individuals on the panel actually becoming leaders in their community, but we don't create leaders. We already invest in leaders in the community to give them additional tools and resources so that they can drive the policy changes that are hindering them. They can have an active role in transforming the system to end mass incarceration. And we do that with our emerging leaders, our Leading with Conviction, which is a year-long training program. We also launched and led the Close Rikers campaign, which was led by directly impacted individuals having a voice, not only having a voice, but actually the demand of what the actual results of this closure should actually produce and what those resources should go towards and what the needs of those individuals are. So again, being the baby on this panel and actually investing in the individuals that are being serviced is actually an honor. So thank you.
I mean, talking about like college for women, empowering and building up communities, talking about obviously advocacy, reinvesting in communities, and then like also building up this capacity in emerging leaders, right, around advocacy and policy work too. I think it's all consistent, like tied together, right? Which leads us to my colleague and dear friend, Julio Medina, right, and heading up Exodus, and talk to us about Exodus.
Sure, so thank you first of all, Andre, for having me on the panel and being with such distinguished guests. So Exodus is a nonprofit, started 20 years ago. We service about 2,000 people a year. I think one of the things about Exodus, you know, we mass incarceration has become sexy now. And I think, you know, we started this work when it wasn't. You know, one of my board members recently said, you know, we're kind of in the shadows. I'm fortunate enough to be the founder and realize the potential, I think echoing what everybody say, realizing the potential in so many of the men that I met inside and wondering why are we constantly defined by the worst moment of my lives. So I had some great mentors and brothers like Eddie, as you know, Joseph Hayden, and halfway through my own prison sentence, I woke up and realized that we have to do something different. So for me, Exodus is a personal mission. In those 20 years, we do all the wraparound service. We've moved into policy now, we understand. But one of the things that a particular interest for us is around the vote and understanding the power behind the vote and understanding just some of those things that go along with it. In New York State, as you know, we have about 40,000 people that received a pardon that can vote. And now how do we exercise that power to make certain that candidates that are representing the communities have justice impacted folk at the forefront of their minds. So at Exodus, we try to take a holistic approach. We are a faith-based organization through our name. We don't proselytize, but we believe if you scratch under the surface of hatred and trauma and all those other pieces, there's a God-centered person there that is looking for a second chance. We just need the patience to be able to get to that center.
So God-centered focus, right, centered on like providing wraparound services for formerly incarcerated people, creating opportunities for folk, and voting is kind of central to some of your focus at Exodus, right? So talking about that, we'll jump right into 2019, right? What has happened in 2019? Julio, you mentioned about voting. I'll like direct us to right to the baby, but not the baby, of course, but to DeAnna, of course, around the Close Rikers, right, and talking about that. Then we want to kind of like move around and hear people's thoughts on that. So talk to us about like Close Rikers, that experience, and others chime in as we go along, DeAnna.
So we know the Close Rikers campaign was launched in 2016, and it was launched with the idea of what could we reimagine if we were able to close Rikers, one of the most notorious facilities in New York City, and create something that was more responsive to the needs of the individuals who were going there, but also something that was located that individuals weren't torn away or disconnected from their communities. So definitely the campaign was launched, and it was launched on the evidence and the research based on all the harms and the damage that had been caused there. And even what we saw during the campaign from 2016 to 2019, we saw a continuation. It wasn't as if, oh, they launched a campaign, all eyes are on Rikers, let's stop all this behavior. No, behavior continued. People continued to die, people continued to be tortured all the way up actually, and after, since the vote, individuals have still been harmed.
So there's extreme abuse, trauma,
Exactly.
all those kind of things happening on Rikers
And it
Island.
kind of, one of the mantras that started out of there is the harm and the trauma and the violence is in the walls of the facility, which kind of demonstrates that now that we have had a vote on October 17th, 36-13 by City Council saying we need to close Rikers Island, and we're committed to closing it. And we've still had guards actually not responding to individuals' needs who were threatening suicide.
Sure.
But the ultimate goal of Rikers closing is preparing ourselves to have community-based facilities that respond not only to the individuals under the care of the system, but also to the community. What are the community resources? Can we create a space that the community can access services that is open to the community? And when we do that, what is the cost savings to the taxpayers of New York City, which we know, I think it was around $300,000 a year to house someone on Rikers, where we're totally cutting that cost in half. So now we have this vote, 2026, and we close in Rikers. Now the real work begins. I tell my team, close Rikers campaign to get City Council to vote was the easy.
Right.
Now the real work happens. Where does those cost investment go? How do we build communities? Each community has a different need. The Bronx need is different from Brooklyn need.
Sure.
And if we don't identify that and start fighting for that, what traditionally happens is the most marginalized communities still get left out. And our goal is to make sure that those communities don't get left out. They reap the benefits of this fight we have pushed in 2019.
Got it. Stan, I know you were appointed to like being on the committee or something, the council around corrections, the commission in that way. What was that process like for you as someone who's formerly incarcerated, being in that space, the kind of challenges that existed there, and your other thoughts around the closed Rikers and the borough-based jails being constructed?
The process of the Lippman Commission was really about going around and continuing a conversation about the damage that Rikers Island is doing. And Rikers Island, not as a building, but the institution of corrections. And what we laid out there was the recommendation that DeAnna, Just Leadership, and other advocates had already been calling for, was that we needed to close Rikers, but we needed to fundamentally change the way the Department of Correction operates. And so in our report, in the Lippman report, we called for enhanced training, because you gotta change the culture of care, custody, and control to this is, how do I take this moment in this person's life and help them reimagine what life could be like outside of these bars, right? So that the officers are not there just to detain people and to be in control of people, but to help elevate people, to help people get access to services. So we laid all of that out in the report. And so the closed Rikers is two elements. One is around closing down that institution, but it's about fundamentally changing the way that the city approaches policing, mass incarceration, and reintegration.
And Vivian, I know that obviously for the women that's been incarcerated, that are incarcerated on Rikers or detained on Rikers Island, right? You know, we have Beyond Rosie's that's in existence now in 2019. I think Sharon White Harrington is like leading that in some way. Like your thoughts about the impact of the closure of Rikers, like on women. What would that mean?
Sure. So there's a couple of layers to the impact that I'd like to talk about. Now, when you look at the Women's Justice Initiative that is sponsoring the Beyond Rosie's campaign, and you have conversations with each of those women, you'll find out that they had the type of supports they needed when they got out. And the women represented on that committee all went through this process of leadership development. And so they are driving the demands for the women. They want women off of Rikers Island immediately, even before the deadline to close Rikers, and they are proposing ways that the city can make that happen. They feel that the numbers should be excruciatingly low for women in prison, that there should be alternatives offered for anybody who has what they now call a city year. Why bother? Find an alternative to incarceration program that is really going to be useful to that woman in that 1 year space, because a city year really doesn't benefit anybody. It just costs the city money.
Sure.
And then the other thing that the women are focused on is the quality and the depths of the services that are provided, because many women are heads of household and they need a higher level of support a higher level of education in order to sustain themselves in a city as expensive as New York City. It is horrendously expensive to live here. So they are driving the conversation, partly because the Lippman Commission, what's wonderful, Judge Lippman I'm a fan of the whole commission. One of the initial things they overlooked is that they didn't have a formerly incarcerated woman on the commission, and I let them know that right away. But since then, I've been able to partner with Judge Lippman and with Anna from the New York Women's Foundation to make sure that women's voices are being heard, and that is the benefit of the Beyond Rosie's campaign, which is a wonderful organization supported by Rita Zimmers and Housing Plus Solutions.
Got it. And Julio, your thoughts on like the closure of Rikers, et cetera. Then I want to transition, for the sake of time, unfortunately, right into the town hall meeting that occurred, that many of you were part of and led, and thoughts on that. So Julio, what are your thoughts on like the closure of Rikers and borough-based jails?
Yeah, so my concern, and I was on the Lippman Commission, and it was an honor to serve, of course, but I think one of the things when we look at it, my concern was that we don't create 4 small Rikers Islands, right? I think when we think about culture, and DeAnna, you hit it on the head, when we think about culture, we have to be meticulous on how this culture is now, because we can easily transform the same violent culture into these smaller jails. So for me, just being on a commission, I'm one of the co-chairs of the culture committee, and it's just making sure that we look at this very differently. Like, we're valuing human life that goes in, that training is totally different for correction officers that go on. Because the one thing that I've learned in the Lippman Commission that I think is just so important, so we would go out to Brooklyn, to these different places, and I was kind of the scout. They would send me out to go and talk amongst the folk, right? So I'm talking, what do you think about this, before they saw me actually go on stage. And it's not that they don't want the jails, right? It's just parking was one of the big things, believe it or not. It's like, listen, we're not opposed to getting people to come out of these jails better, right? Whole humans. I think the concerns were more on not only the rollout, but will you now create something else here that's already what we have? It has to be different. And I think so for me, my strongest kind of urgent concern is that we do this in a way in 2026 that we make sure folk are trained going in there, that if this should be a job, this should be a mission, this should be a calling for someone to want to go in. I know they're looking at this Norway model that I've heard a lot about, that really values the person that's going in. And we've had these conversations with the commissioner at Rikers Island now, and she's the hardest thing is to change a culture, and we all understand that. But we cannot, the historical violence that exists on Rikers Island cannot be transferred into these smaller jails.
Got it. And so I know, in 2019, something really amazing happened that I was witness to and party to by virtue of watching it live stream, and that's the first time in the history of the criminal justice reform movement that leaders were interviewing presidential candidates around criminal justice reform issues specifically. And so I had the honor of watching people interview folk and really kind of dig in where they needed to. And I was really grateful for that. And so, again, talk to us a little bit about that. Vivian, I know you were one of the persons that questioned some of the candidates. You too, DeAnna, and Stan and others were present. So talk to us, starting with you, Vivian, what was that experience like? And obviously it's not the end of things, right? But it's a huge step. And it demonstrates everyone's commitment to that
But before
movement.
Vivian goes,
Okay.
I want to lift this up.
Yeah.
These 2 women were the ones who drove that initiative.
Okay.
They were part of a team that brought that whole thing together, that had a vision about when we have political leaders that talk about we want to represent the people, they have to represent all people.
Sure.
And the voices of men and women impacted by the system need to be heard. And so I want to lift these 2 women up because they were not only the interviewers, they were the drivers behind that whole event.
So as the organizer, driver, and creator of that,
Yes.
Vivian, talk to us about what that was about. We have a few minutes. Just
Yeah, and I'll be brief because I want DeAnna to kick in.
Sure.
So sometime over the summer, I heard about this event in Texas. It was women from all backgrounds and all areas that came together to tell presidential candidates what they wanted as women. I'm like, that's a good idea. And I think formerly incarcerated people should do the same thing. So on one of the weekly phone calls we have with an organization we belong to, I suggested it, and everybody liked the idea. Well, it could have ended there, but I'm a person who, if I say I'm going to do something, I do it. So I started picking up the phone, and I started making it happen and asked people to partner with me. I got 4 amazing partners in DeAnna, Hoskins, Daryl Atkinson, and Norris Henderson. And we initiated it under Voters Organized to Educate, which is a C4 that Norris runs. Everybody cooperated. Without the team, it wouldn't have happened. The presidential candidates were hard to engage in terms of getting them to commit to showing up, because there's a lot of gates you have to go through before you actually get the candidates to even hear the request. We are very proud that Cory Booker and Kamala Harris showed up, as well as Tom Steyer. And those conversations, I think, allowed people to see us in a role that they couldn't imagine a formerly incarcerated being in. And it allowed candidates, not only for 2020, but for every year to come, to realize there is a voting population out there that we are not paying attention to.
Sure, so it sets the precedent, obviously, for what's to come. And
Oh,
so DeAnna, talk.
It's got to happen next year too.
Yes.
That's exactly right. DeAnna, talk to us about that experience. Then I'll get Stan and Julio and about like your witnessing of that and what that was like.
So really quick, I want to say Vivian was very modest when she had the idea, and she called me, and I was like, oh, that sounds like an idea. And when we presented it, everybody did not agree immediately. They were like, how, what are you guys thinking? But it was just because it was huge. It was unprecedented. We had never heard of it. So definitely, as she started being who she is, continuing on. But even within our own circle of leaders, that appeared impossible to do and impossible to pull off. And I think that's what leadership is, that leadership doesn't take anybody else's thought of being impossible. Leadership keeps moving. So I want to thank her for her leadership and
Thank
for
you,
keep
Vivian.
calling me, and I'm like, oh, okay, I guess let's do it. But no, for me, while the 3 candidates who showed up, I am very appreciative of that. It was bigger than that for me. It was bigger than that for me to show the possibilities of what we could do as a movement, as individuals who have been impacted, but also the power that we are not excluded from doing what we want to do and holding people accountable. So for me, it was just the mere fact that it was created and it happened, and that we are now looking to host and to create this on a continuing basis, that as directly impacted people across this country who are most impacted by this topic, I don't need anybody else to run this conversation. We'll run our own conversations and ask our own questions. So we want to start setting our own precedent for that.
Sure. And Stan, and then Julio.
And for me, when I was in the system, what I would always hear about who came back, right? So you would never hear the stories about how well people are doing or that there was success on the other side. So you always knew who came back, who's in that facility, who's in that day. Thousands of people around the country who are impacted by the criminal justice system have seen people who are sitting in that room engaging with some of our political leaders at the highest level. That is about hope, that is about ownership, that is about leadership. It's about all the things that aren't necessarily conversated about in the circles in jails and in prisons, or even the folks who are doing the work don't necessarily conversate, but they all saw it that day. They saw it through live stream, they saw it through the online. That was the biggest impact for me, is that we stood in that moment to talk about there's a bunch of people who are not going back, who are leading in the conversation on this day. So very exciting for me.
Julio?
Historic. It was historic. It was a historic event. We had a watch party, so everyone was excited about this, and I think it brings hope. I think one of the things for me, a good leader, first learns to follow. And watching you all, I've learned to follow, and I've learned to try to do these things very, very differently. Thus, to exercise our power and to exercise that voting power, so we can begin that next step. As we all know, there's 35 seats coming up right here in City Council. I want to just look at this as we think about the power that we have to be able to say, now how many directly impacted folk that we get in one of those seats, and who are our candidates, because you're leading the charge. And now what becomes the next step, and how do we do this in a way that it not only shows the world, who we are, and we're not the worst moment of our lives, and we've come to this new precipice where we're able to say, no, this is who we are now, and there's talent inside those walls, and we want to make sure we pull that talent out. And you're right, Vivian, they don't have jobs, but they have careers. And the only way we can do that, I think, if we exercise the franchise, there's so many people that are now doing that and talking about it. Exodus, we have something called the Peace Plan with participatory voting and some of the things that we're looking to launch. But throughout the country, we're hearing kind of this echo of what do we do. And that started because of the impact that you've had in being able to introduce presidential candidates, and drilling them around justice impacted folk and what the future will look like. So I'm grateful to be a part of this as well.
Yeah, you just gave me a new idea about the city council.
No, it's
So here we go.
fantastic. And you think about the mass organization of this kind of leadership and power throughout the country. This block in and of itself can influence policy and influence who gets in the seat of highest seat of office in this country. Last night I was with Deputy Mayor Thompson, and he was speaking about this idea about people organizing in NYCHA houses, communities, to demand that like Verizon and other companies give them like incentives and like kickbacks or whatever. And I think with this block of leadership that we have throughout the nation, we have to leverage that power too to make things meaningfully changeful for us.
That's right.
So I'm really excited to have had all of you here. I know our time is short. We'll try to get you all back at some point. But I just want to thank everybody. And there's so much more to discuss about the changes in criminal justice reform around the country and just in the movement generally. And so our 4 guests, all of whom are executive leaders in different capacities, doing some amazing work, all of whom I admire and respect, and so many others like model their behavior after. Just want to thank everybody for joining us on this episode as we look at 2019 year in review on criminal justice reform and beyond. Again, I'd like to invite you, the viewers, back for more thought-provoking discussion. In the meantime, on behalf of the Fortune Society, we thank you so much for tuning in to Both Sides of the Bars. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us on the web at fortunesociety.org. That's fortunesociety.org, or on Facebook by typing in the Fortune Society. This is Andre Ward, and I appreciate you joining us as we critically look at both sides of the bars.